Hello, you're watching Talk On, the podcast of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle, Germany. My name is Christoph Brumann.
And I'm Jovan Maud. And in this podcast, we're going to be talking about current research and debates in the field of social anthropology.
My guest today is Mascha Schulz, postdoctoral researcher in the department, the Anthropology of Politics and Governance. Hello, Mascha.
And thank you very much for having me.
Today, Mascha, we decided to talk about a special issue you and Stefan Binder from the University of Zurich have been co-editing. And that special issue of the journal Religion and Society, due to appear in 2023, is entitled The Anthropology of Nonreligion, Committed to Religious Others, ? Well, non-religion, pun intended. What the hell is non-religion?
Yes, that's actually a question I receive quite often, so it's a very good question. Basically, you could argue it's an umbrella term that subsumes different kinds of people and attitudes and positions that are not religious, like atheists, agnostics, rationalists, humanists, or those who consider themselves secular. So that's like very broadly who they are or what that is. And in general, there is comparatively little research on those who are not religious. So social science has somehow always been quite interested in religion. That's always something they sought to explain.
Particularly anthropology.
Yes.
I think religion, kinship are the two topics that probably have been, let's say, most where anthropology has most claim to be the expert in a way, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And secularism or atheism, by contrast, has been considered something that's just there and, that's kind of neutral. So there's comparatively little research on this, and it has been much later become a topic for research. But there is another reason why non-religion is much less researched, and that's because it's much more hard to grasp than the religious. First of all, religion is very often organized. If you think, for example, of Christianity, there's a church that you can start your research from and your theorization from, and it's very clear. And in non-religion, that's not always the case.
Oh, okay.
There are some organized forms of non-religion. For example, you have the Sunday Assembly, which is like the example that you can take because they've modeled everything after a church. It's considered an atheist church.
Where's that?
It's in the UK. It was funded in London. Josh Bullock has done research on this, and they have like all these rituals that Christianity have, live circle rituals. They have a Sunday Assembly every Sunday for where they like sing together, but it's not religious, it's not theistic.
Yeah, come to think of it, like here in this area of East Germany, there's, for example, the Jugendweihe, which youth undergo at probably 14 years of age or so, which was introduced by the socialist state, the GDR, basically to have an equivalent to, I guess, what's consecration in a Catholic context, and it has survived. It's still popular today. I mean, modeled on religion in a way,
But non-religion is not always organized like this. Like we have some, like actually more border cases or more extreme cases of organization, but in many cases it's more elusive. Like many people might not believe in religion or not believe in the religion they're born into, but are not organized in any way. They might not even identify with being agnostic or atheist.
Oh, okay.
You also have forms that are much more informal organized, like through Facebook pages or Reddit, and there's lots of research on that.
And now you've done this special issue on the topic. Why is that? I mean, what was your motivation to do so?
Yeah, first of all, anthropology has very much been a latecomer in the debate on non-religion. So social sciences and humanities like sociology, political science, and religious studies have been the forerunner. And they have also
sociology is all about the modernization being secularization and so on.
Yes, and this debate about secularism and whether there is a secularization, whether there's a revival of religion, all this has very much shaped the terms of the debate.
Well, okay.
And also, besides this kind of more theoretical framing that shapes the debate, it has also been framed by kind of the methodologies that they use. So sociology or religious studies more often also did this kind of surveys where you would tick that you are either a Christian or an atheist. And this kind of understanding has very much shaped also the debate on
where it's an either or, yeah?
Yes.
Basically a binary. And
yes.
What you're interested in is probably more the gray zone in between, right?
Yes, we are much more interested in non-religion as something that's a lived reality that's very often much more elusive, unstable, and that it's embedded in power relations and political histories of a particular context. And I had just finished my PhD on non-religion and secularism in Bangladesh when we started the special issue. And my colleague Stefan Binder, with whom I have co-edited the special issue, he had published his book Total Atheism, where he looks at secular activists and the politics of secular difference in southern India.
Okay.
And we were both kind of dissatisfied with how the debate was framed and how there were very little of the debate that we needed for our discussions. And at the same time, we thought that there was also a shift in the debate. So while anthropology was the latecomer in this debate, there's quite some research for the last 2 decades. So the work of Johannes Quack, for example, Disenchanting India, or Matthew Engels, who works on the British Humanist Society. They have been like the forerunners, and they looked at this kind of organized forms of non-religion. And more recently, there has been an increase in research and also more diverse forms of non-religion, also non-organized forms of non-religion.
I see.
And much of this research has not been published so far. So we thought that we bring all these scholars together in order to show what actually the anthropology can contribute to the understanding of non-religion.
That would be my next question. What actually can be the contribution of anthropology to all this? I mean, can't we just leave it to religious studies or found non-religious studies in your field? I mean, why anthropology? What's anthropology good at?
I think anthropology does make a very important and very complementary perspective and can bring, unique understandings of non-religion.
In what way?
In the way that it looks at non-religion as a situated practice rather than as a fixed and stable identity. So if you have this survey logic, you understand this is either atheist or Christianity, and you understand non-religion very often as something like that's rational and cognitive. That's like a conviction.
Yeah, beliefs, basically.
Or an identity.
But not practices, yeah?
Yes. And also there was a tendency to view like the religious as more like the emotional and they're maybe embodied, but rationalism qua this like rational thing is something that's quite cognitive.
Okay, so no emotions involved. Huh?
But the research of anthropology shows how this is very much an embodied practice and one that's linked to different kinds of materials and that's also shifting in different situations. So if you look at a rational organization, you very often look at their discourses, while we very often look also at practices and interactions.
What people do, what people feel, etc.
Yes.
I mean, that's a move religious studies has also been making or the anthropology of religion to focus more on the everyday, the mundane, the material, media and religion, all these topics. Is this kind of what you're also envisioning now for the study of non-religion, or what the contributions to the volume are doing?
Yeah, the movement is quite of similar. And I think it's also like in religious studies, there's also this move to the ethnographic, I would say, or within this move to the material comes from like an ethnographic perspective. And then people often think that, okay, religious material, it's kind of obvious. You can identify certain objects that are religious, but what is non-religious objects? That's not clear to people necessarily. And how we conceptualize embodiment here has like very different shapes or different dimensions that also all appear in our contribution. So, for example, if you take the contribution by Lena Richter on non-religious non-believers in Morocco, they often find it difficult in the context of Morocco to identify explicitly as atheist or as non-believers.
Why is that?
That's because atheism is looked down upon. It's considered to be associated with immorality, with westernization, and with leaving established norms of what's appropriate. So it's very often considered as something problematic and also a challenge to the authority. People communicate this often in much more subtle ways. So in order not to offend, for example, the religious feelings of their own family members, they would rather, for example, change their clothing and thereby indicate a changing attitude towards religion. Or, for example, you would have certain cafes where you would find non-religious people, but it's not a place explicitly for the non-religious.
It's not a church of the non-religious, but it's a gathering place, an informal gathering place. Okay.
And you have much more ambivalent signs, like having a dog, for example. This is also something that you find in Bangladesh, because having a dog is not something considered that a Muslim would do. Once you have a dog, you kind of indicate your attitude to religion.
As an ardent Muslim, you wouldn't consider keeping a dog. Oh, okay, I see.
So there are some kinds of signifiers.
But you don't cry it out loud, right? That I found also interesting in that particular article by Lena Richter that, it's a lot depending on the social political context. Whether you are able to kind of live it or like hold back a bit in order not to, not to behave improperly, not to hurt others' feelings, etc. Yeah?
And you might practice a religion not because you believe in it, but just because you do not want
just
to offend others.
Forms, basically. Yeah, and that's something you've yourself been to Japan, right, for a year studying, and my research has been on Japan. That's what you also can often observe there, that people kind of have no problem basically to participate in religious rituals, in Shintoist rituals, for example, but that doesn't necessarily tell you much about their beliefs, and nobody discusses that. So it's basically, for politeness' sake, you wouldn't think of making a big fuss about it, and you just do it, basically. But at the bottom of your heart, you're not convinced by the, let's say, the religious content.
But embodiment in our case is also comes in different ways. So if you talk about situated practices and embodiment, it's not just the performance or the relation of embodied markers in relation to non-belief, but it's also how the embodiment of what we might consider religion plays out. So this comes out very clearly in the article that I've co-authored with Johannes Quack, where we look at
you've got to explain that, I guess.
That's a bit complicated, maybe. But in South Asia, so we look at India and Bangladesh. You have
two individuals, actually.
Two individuals, one Hindu in Bangladesh and one Muslim in India.
Both in a minority position in a way.
Both identify with being Hindu and Muslim and being non-religious, and they identify in quite different ways. So the Hindu in Bangladesh, he does not believe in God and says this quite explicitly, but he totally rejects the term atheist for himself. Because atheism is very much associated with immorality in Bangladesh.
Again,
he's a politician,
Morocco, right?
so if he would identify with that term, that could endanger his career. And the Muslim identifies like as a Muslim atheist, which like many people would find paradoxical, but in the conception of personhood, that's not in South Asia, that's not something that's very paradoxical, because personhood is not something, being a Muslim is not just a religious category, but also a quasi-ethnic category, or kind of a person that you are, and that becomes visible through your body. So names is a very typical example. Through your name, you would mostly understand that a person is a Muslim or a Hindu. That's not
that guy,
true.
Amir. So Amir is a Muslim name.
Yes. Yeah? So you would immediately understand he is a Muslim. But there are also other embodied markers. Like in Bangladesh, you would, for water, what we have here, you have different words. So you would use either pani or jol. So if you use the word pani, it would immediately be visible that you're from a Muslim background. While
Jol is Hindu.
For Hindu.
And you have to pick either of the two. So there's no way not to choose, right?
And it's something quite
food.
embedded.
Yeah, sure. But the same with food, right? I mean, that's what also is being mentioned, like whether you eat pork or beef or so. I mean, you might not be religious, but then still it's a matter whether you want to openly eat the particular kind of food that your religion doesn't like, right?
Yes, and even some people who are like quite explicit atheist, who then say, okay, I might want to try to eat some pork as like the ex-Muslim.
Yeah.
They might even feel this like bodily trained understanding of what pork is. So very often they talk of experience.
Physical revulsion against it because they've been brought up hating pork, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, that I can imagine, of course. Yeah. It doesn't quite go away. I mean, come to think of it, I mean, I don't know how many times I say, I'm not a particular religious person, but I say, Gott sei Dank, thank God. Yeah.
Yes.
It slips all the time, right? Even though I don't know that, even though consciously thinking about it, I wouldn't give God any agency in my everyday life.
Yes.
So. Anyway.
This kinds of speech act are also typical examples.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And then we have embodiment also in a different way that's much more close to, cultivation of a self kind of embodiment. So in Bangladesh, it has become, and I write about this in like in the book that I've published recently, Global Skeptical Publics, that certain traditions of Bengali culture have been established as being media to transform the society towards a more secular society. So certain traditions like Bengali theater or Rabindranath Tagore songs or Kavi Nazrul songs or Gonosongit, these are like all Bengali genres of music that are considered to actually be conducive to create a more secular, religiously plural, accepting society.
Okay.
And that has a lot to do with the history and how Bangladesh has a long history of contested secularism and how this has been merged with Bengali nationalism. So there, the embodiment of the secular is actually through media that in Germany probably no one would consider to be either religious or
religiously
secular.
loaded, okay. But in that context they are, because also of the historical connections.
Yes.
I can see that, okay. There's... I understand also from the articles that like whether you to the degree to which you can live or like embody non-religion, etc., is very much dependent on the social and political context, right?
Yes.
I mean, the Turkish case that Pierre Hecker describes was resistance to non-performance, atheism, and non-religion. Turkey is particularly impressive in this regard, I would say.
Yes, that's absolutely true. So how non-religion is something that people might want to hide is apparent in a couple of articles that we have in this special issue. But the case of Turkey, I think, is most striking in that regard because Turkey has this long history of, embracing secularism after the fall of the Ottoman Empire,
Kemalism,
Kemalism, and at that time also, having political efforts to erase signifiers of religion from the public sphere. So it has been much more in the tradition of, say, France in that regard. And today we have like a total different picture in Turkey because under Erdogan and the AKP government, now we have a utilization of religion or an emphasis on Islam for nationalism in a way that actually imagines the Turkish nation as a nation of Muslims. And this emphasis makes it very difficult for the not small number of Muslims who are not practicing or who have left Islam to actually live their life. And because of the political conditions, any act that's actually practicing non-religion in a way, like non-participating in fasting or non-participating in Friday sermons, results into being seen as a political act, because it kind of not only challenges the religious order, but it also changes the power order.
Erdogan's and the AKP's rule, of course. Yes. Sure. Okay. Yeah.
So you can have people needing to find a fine line of how they can position themselves, and that also results into the fact that many people might want to practice religion, not because they are interested in religion, but
because of social pressure, basically. But let's think a bit about Western societies like our own, for example, here in Germany. I mean, there the social pressure to be religious isn't particularly developed. What would, let's say, this non-religion perspective contribute to understanding, let's say, Western, secular, rich countries like ours?
Yeah, so I think actually that this division of the West as secular and the West as non-secular, that comes from the secularization debate, I think, isn't particularly helpful here.
Okay, sorry to disappoint you so much.
No. So, for example, if you look at the US, you have this discrimination against atheists also quite a lot, not everywhere in the same time, but you have this Bible Belt, and there has been lots of research done on this, how people might want to hide their atheism because there's such a discrimination.
Because regionally, it's can be a very religious country.
Yes.
Right? In some regions of the US.
Yes.
There's a particular interesting contribution to that special issue by Laura Zwissler, religiously non-religious, the secular activism of the Satanic temple that actually is placed in the United States.
Yes.
That's, I think, in this case, a particular telling example, right?
It's very telling because it shows how non-religion there evolves on the background of the secular that privileges religion. And a certain kind of religion, namely Christianity and Protestantism. So they take issue with this privilegization of
they
religion.
Meaning the Satanic temple members.
And things for, introduction of religious education in schools or certain monuments and all these kinds. So in order to do activism against this, they have founded the Satanic temple, where they have what Zwissler calls a serious parody of this religion, freedom for religion. So by claiming to be a religion, they do activism against religion, kind of, or for the right to be non-religious. So, for example, when then there was a move that certain Christian groups wanted to do free distributions of religious books, they also went forward and said, yes, we want to contribute because there's this freedom of religion, as the others just have shown. So we also want to distribute.
Distribute our books as well, or like religious displays somewhere in public. Then they wanted their own religious symbols to be displayed as well, right?
Yes.
But basically to fight the dominance of, or let's say the tacit dominance of Protestant churches in what, on the face of it, is secular society, right?
Yes.
I mean, the constitution or the laws are secular, and no particular religion is privileged, but in actual fact, what you see in everyday life is Protestantism all around, particularly in that southern Bible Belt.
And because it's so tacit, this privilegization of Protestantism, it's the easiest to fight through this parody, because by claiming to have the same rights, you can see how there's not the same right for all kinds of religious groups. But it's not just the US where you can see this privileging of Christianity. Like if you take Germany, for example, you also have this entanglement between the state and Christianity. I mean, there are various levels where we can see this: church tax, holidays, which are like, most of them are Christian.
Right.
We have, for example, 5% Muslims, but we don't have any Muslim holiday.
Exactly. No Muslim public holiday.
And you also have like sermons, for example, for school enrollment, which at least in Western Germany, where you can also see how
all that debate they had in Bayern, the southern German state, about crucifixes, in the classroom.
So secularism often comes in as a discourse in Germany in order to promote religious freedoms for some, while it also goes along with the privileging of certain other religions like Christianity.
Okay, which are more or less the default, in many ways, and that's probably not just to the degree it would have been in some other countries like France, for example.
And I think that highlighting these kinds of normativities and how secularism plays out in actual political struggles and everyday conversations about it is actually one of the strengths of the ethnographic method.
Well, you've yourself done a lot of research on non-religion in Bangladesh. It already came up in our conversation, and you did a PhD study on it, which will soon appear as a book under the title Cultivating Secularity, Politics, Embodiment and Criticism of Religion in Bangladesh. Now, how did you become interested in non-religion in this particular country, Bangladesh?
Yes, that's because the case of Bangladesh, I think, is particularly interesting. And there has been a long history of contested secularism in Bangladesh, and the issue became particularly tense in 2013, when there was a huge polarization that has a long history, but really exploded in 2013.
In what way?
That has to do with the history of Bangladesh. So Bangladesh became independent in 1971 from Pakistan. And in this independence, they also formed as a secular nation. That was one of the constitutional 4 pillars, to be a secular country. But then it became a contested principle within the history of Bangladesh. So Islam was reintroduced as the state religion, for example. The constitutional principle was erased again. And in 2013...
Let's just recap. Pakistan and Bangladesh were one country once, right?
Yes.
Until 1971. They were both Muslim, whereas in the middle, India's overwhelmingly Hindu.
Yes.
But then Bangladesh fought for independence basically against the big Pakistan being the religious country, whereas Bangladesh conceived of itself as secular in that independence.
And that was, of course, in the Cold War context, where the US supported the Islamic countries, and the Soviet Union, was more pushing towards atheism, supported India. So in this context.
But doesn't mean that Bangladesh became a fully secular country. It's an overwhelmingly Muslim country, right?
Yeah, most people are practicing Muslims, about 90%. But nevertheless, secularism remains a point of positive identification for most of the people.
Political principle, and there's parties, right, in which are secular, right?
Yes, so the Awami League, who also were the first party who ruled the country, like Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the first president of the country, was part of the Awami League.
I see.
And now her daughter, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, is the president. So this ruling party also claims to be a secular party and wants to promote secularism. At the same time, they always are eager to distance themselves from atheism and non-belief.
Yeah.
And
so it's a secular state, but it's tolerant of religion, and almost every party official is a religious person themselves, right?
Yes.
A Muslim,
and there's a huge emphasis on the multiplicity of religions rather than the eraser of religion.
I see. Okay, so that's an interesting context, I guess. But how did you go about doing your research? I can imagine, okay, you have a secular party, but otherwise, I mean, if everyone is a Muslim in everyday life, it might be quite difficult to actually find non-religion, right?
Actually, it's not so difficult, but because the issue is so sensitive, it became quite difficult. And that was particularly at the time when I did my research, because following the Shabak movement, there was a defamation by Islamists of this movement as an atheist movement. And following this movement, there were like a number of people who were defamed as atheist bloggers, and you had some of them being killed, some have been escaping from Bangladesh, applying for asylum in Europe or leaving for India. So it was a highly volatile time politically, and one in which atheism was totally politicized. So I tried to frame my research not around the issue of atheism or secularism explicitly, but more around the topic of politics, which made it easier. And there are certain milieus in Bangladesh which are considered to be quite secular and where you would find many people who are not practicing. So I would not go around and ask people whether they're atheist, but rather through these milieus, come across.
You're looking for the little non-religious things and basically then asking people about what that meant for them, etc. Right?
And for this, I had 3 like core sites and networks that I utilized, which is cultural activists, because Bengali cultural activists are considered to be secular, and you actually find quite a good number of, non-practicing, even identifying atheists in this milieu. Then I also looked at party politicians of the ruling party Awami League, and I did research on one university campus, because also a university campus is a hub
of non-religion. Okay, I see. Were people interested about your own position towards religion or non-religion? Did that play a role? Were they interested? How did that factor into your field research?
Yeah, that's also a good question, how I positioned myself. And that was actually often mirroring like how people approach this, how they conceptualize religion. So very often they ask me about my religion. But also very often they assume that I'm Christian. And in their understanding of what Christianity means, namely not necessarily a category that you practice, but also like, as I explained earlier, you can be a Muslim, but that's qua you're being born in a Muslim family.
Being born into a Muslim family.
And in that way, I always...
You were assumed to be Christian.
I was assumed to be Christian, and I would also confirm very often that I'm Christian. We didn't say much about the degree of religiosity that I practice.
Okay, and in that particular aspect, they were also one particular interested.
Yes, but it would often be also a question of how I positioned myself in a much more subtle way, like the people themselves do. Communicate these things in a more subtle way. So they dress in a certain way that was already indicate a certain attitude.
And will be read as such by others, right?
Yes. And I would dress often slightly different when I met Islamic leaders than I would when I went to a secularist event.
But that's... okay. Interesting. Thank you very much, Mascha. At least for myself, I can say that you've really converted me to the virtues of an anthropological approach towards studying non-religion. I hope that's also true for our listeners. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for listening.